Hello, all. I am Dr. Joanne Yanez, Executive Director for the Association of Accredited Naturopathic Medical Colleges, and I welcome you to today's webinar. We have with us Dr. Romi Fung, who is faculty at CCNM, Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine. And Dr. Fung today is going to speak to us about our brain's potential and ways of helping keep our brains healthy for longer. So I'm excited to start this webinar. Before we begin, though, just going to cover a few housekeeping things. Dr. Fung, if you can go to the next slide, please. So for those of you in attendance, please note that we welcome questions, but please use the Q&A function of Zoom so that we can keep track of the questions for today. We are recording this session and we will share it when it is ready. If you do have any problems or you have any questions either during or afterwards, you can always reach out to us at info@aanmc.org. Next slide. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Fung, and very excited for today's talk about this, and also Dr. Fung sharing his journey. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yanez. I am super excited, and I already see the numbers and the participants to be right above 50. This is amazing. So welcome. So as Dr. Yanez mentioned, my name is Dr. Romi Fung, and I'm just going to start off by introducing a little bit about myself and my background, and we're going to get started with learning a bit more about our brain. But I did my training at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine, Toronto, and obtained a Doctor of Naturopathic Medicine and started my practice in approximately 2018. And I focus my practice more so in cognitive health and patients living with dementia. But while I was building my practice and seeking these patients and really working with them nutritionally and with their lifestyle, with traditional Chinese medicine and herbs and all that, I found that there was a kind of almost like a disconnect when it comes to our knowledge of cognitive impairment, cognitive decline, and how we could support those with cognitive impairment, not necessarily just with the aspect of clinical health, but also with a sense of community. And that got me obtaining my Master's of Science in Aging and Health from Queen's University, where I started my research in using curcumin as a intervention for cognitive impairment. And building on there, I went on and completing my PhD. I currently am a PhD candidate in aging and health, also from Queen's University, where I did my PhD competency exam in the COVID-19 measures with older adults living in isolation and loneliness, and how the COVID-19 lockdown measures impacted their health from a physical, mental, emotional standpoint, and also cognitive standpoint. So that's been quite the eye-opener, especially from a clinical standpoint. I did some additional training in terms of dementia care and cognitive support. I am a Bredesen Protocol RECODE 2.0 practitioner, as well as a certified brain health practitioner from the Amen Clinics under Amen University, and have done my training as a certified dementia care practitioner. So overall, I pretty much dive, live, and thrive in the idea of cognitive health, and am very passionate about working with my patients, optimizing their cognitive health. I've also done a lot of speaking, and I'm very happy to be doing this to really optimize the cognitive health in several communities, including my own, but also across Canada. So just as a disclosure here that this is for educational purposes, not intended to provide any medical advice. But if this is something that you would like to be pursuing with yourself, that I would highly recommend that you consult your medical doctor, nurse practitioner, or naturopathic physician. So my agenda here is we're going to discuss what really is dementia, because we have a lot of different definitions. And it's quite amazing that even just a diagnosis can have so many definitions. In fact, part of my master's and PhD research talks about the definition. One example I have is the term pharmacology. And we know pharmacology as the prescriptive drugs, medications. But do you know what polypharmacy is and how that would actually contribute to health conditions, adverse effects, interactions, and all that? Well, in the literature, in a literature review, there's at least 180 different definitions for what polypharmacy is. And you would think, but I thought polypharmacy is just too many drugs. But there's actually different factors of polypharmacy that's also connected with cognitive impairment, because the interactions of a number of these drugs can impact your cognition. But to have a definition of polypharmacy at over 180 different definitions, we need to be on the same page. And that comes to be the same way when it comes to solidifying the diagnosis in terms of dementia. So we're going to be talking a bit about that. And then I'll start talking about the brain as a reflection of the body systems. I've come to envelop, love, and appreciate the fact that our brain is not a separate entity. And even though we talk about dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, and all that, everyone's always pertaining that to the brain. Well, there's a lot about the body that is reflected on the brain, and we need to take care of our bodies to be able to better take care of our brain. So I'll talk about that and how that sets the foundations for brain health. And then how, as naturopathic doctors or naturopathic doctors to be, if you're coming in as a prospective student, how can we treat and prevent dementia? And then at the end, I'll share a bit about my story and my love for naturopathic medicine. So dementia, it's unfortunate, but currently there's more than 55 million people worldwide that have the diagnosis of dementia, and 60% of them live in low and middle income countries. So these are people who may not have access to even basics of care. And that can be quite saddening when there's so much about our brain health and cognition that can be done with fundamentals and quite cheaply. But every year, this number is growing. Every year, we are having an increased incidence of 10 million new cases worldwide. And this is something that I believe can be widely prevented with basic means. But when we define dementia, the World Health Organization made an update in 2023 and is now incorporating more domains when it comes to dementia. Because probably you're thinking, and I'm going to ask soon, but we think about dementia as short-term memory loss, but there's probably more to that. We're going to get there. But dementia results from a variety of diseases and injuries that affect the brain. And there's many different types of dementias. Dementia is that umbrella term, but Alzheimer's disease is one specific dementia and is the most common form of dementia that can contribute to approximately 60 to 70% of cases as determined by the World Health Organization. But there are many other different types of dementias, from vascular dementia, frontal temporal lobe dementia, Parkinson's dementia. So there are many different types that, depending on what is impacting the brain, what, where, and how, that could impact the diagnosis of that specific dementia. So I like to always engage my audience here, no matter if it's in person, live, or if it's virtual. And I would love for you to write this in the chat box below, is when you think about dementia, what do you automatically think about? What are some considerations? Well, first off, what do you think about first? Leave that in the chat box, and I would love to hear where we're all coming from. So again, in the chat box or the Q&A, let me know what you think dementia is. We have memory loss. That's probably the first thing that is the most given when it comes to dementia and cognition, is we think about short-term memory loss, and that tends to be the very first few things that happen. You might be forgetting your keys, you might be forgetting things, forgetting the most basic things, such as your keys, wallet, trinkets, and then eventually it goes on to people you might know that were familiar to you at some point. And I like to think of it as an onion. you're peeling the layers off of an onion. The first few things that get peeled off are the most recent factors. So that's where your keys, wallet, neighborhood, directions, that could be the first and few things. And then later on, that could progress if not treated and intervened soon enough. It can progress to family members, names, and even the ability to recognize certain things that you usually would know, like your toothbrush. So I see a lot of engagement. This is perfect. I love that. Thank you so much. So I see memory loss. I think of senior citizens mostly. And here's the thing about senior citizens. Most of us will experience that progression of memory decline. But now we're seeing a lot of decline, especially in the younger adults. And I see patients that are with cognitive decline and cognitive impairment as young as in their 40s or even, early 50s. And that is quite, quite challenging for a lot of us. Think of geriatric patients, cognitive impairment, elderly population, loss of safety and functional tasks. Absolutely. I love that answer right there, where eventually you might forget how to use a door or a toothbrush. And the first thing that you also want to be wary of when you're working or living with someone with cognitive impairment is their safety, because slips and falls can impact that. I see statins and fish oil deficiency, short-term memory loss, plaque formation. That's the hallmark that we have in defining Alzheimer's disease, is the buildup of beta amyloid plaque and tau tangles. Emotional ability, the burden on caregivers, forgetting things, loneliness. Oh my goodness. I wrote that paper on in my PhD candidacy exam. And needless to say, I wrote about 50 pages in a day and a half in the scorching 40-degree weather here in Western Canada. Decreased function, decision-making, sad, depression. We're seeing depression as probably one of the early signs of dementia, especially if it was something that was never occurred before in childhood development and early adulthood. So I see even sugar, sleep deprivation, gene therapy. So there's so much about there. Ooh, I love someone that used the term sundowners. This is perfect. We have a very educated group right here, and I really appreciate your engagement. So you've also mentioned about some considerations and treatments that come to mind. I saw ginkgo, I saw fish oils, vitamin D and all that. These are all very good treatments. Then comes our role as naturopathic doctors is what is really needed at that point. So first off, let's get on with defining what dementia is. And the World Health Organization describes dementia as a syndrome that can be caused by a number of diseases which over time destroy nerve cells and damage the brain, typically leading to deterioration in cognitive function or the ability to process thought beyond what might be expected from the usual consequences of biological aging. So there is normal decline. And if you've ever met or read about the centenarians, those that live beyond 100 years old, they're still quite sharp. There is still normal decline, but when it becomes to be that it's affecting your ability to conduct your activities of daily living. So your ability to bathe yourself, dress yourself, cook for yourself, and even just conduct your everyday tasks, then we make that definition of dementia. So this definition is not to be treated lightly, but someone with just short-term memory loss doesn't necessarily mean they have dementia. So while consciousness is not affected, the impairment in cognitive function is commonly accompanied and occasionally preceded by changes in mood, emotional control, behavior, or motivation. So when someone mentioned about depression and all that, that's actually one of the growing studies right there, with depression preceding cognitive decline. So when I define dementia, I look into something called the 7 A's of dementia. And if we have any prospective medical students, this is your first day you actually get to think and maybe even use these terms, and people will start thinking that you're a doctor already. So the 7 A's of dementia in definition include, first one, anosognosia. And anosognosia just means that the brain was damaged to an extent that it's hard for patients to recognize that they have it. So in other words, this is probably another term for denial, that they deny that they do have the cognitive decline, and they may resist help, may refuse treatment, and pretty much become quite defensive. So these are people that you have to be able to support, work with, and be on terms with them, saying, the definition probably is the taboo word that we're talking about. And there are ways that caregivers can communicate that effectively with their loved ones. Secondly, amnesia. I'm pretty sure we all know the term amnesia. That's memory loss. So first off, short-term memory loss. If you're amnestic, that's impacting your short-term memories first, and then eventually long-term memories as the disease progresses. Then there's something called aphasia, which is the ability to communicate, both in terms of cognitively, so being able to utilize words, put words into sentences, the ability to speak, understand language, and even read and write is in this realm of aphasia. Then there's agnosia, which is the inability to recognize objects or even recognizing objects using your own senses. So not just with the sense of sight, you might see a toothbrush and you think, oh, I know what to do with that. I'm going to start brushing my teeth. But for patients living with dementia, if they're agnostic, you hand them a toothbrush, they might be quite confused as to what they should be doing with the toothbrush. But actually, if you guide them, hold their hand gently and start brushing your teeth, they might actually start building up those connections again. And then they start to remember, oh, right, I'm supposed to be brushing my teeth. So even just some guidance actually goes a long way. And it's about firing those neurons for those that have this level of agnosia. Then there's apraxia, which is the loss of motor skills, so movement and coordination. Coordination can also come very closely with the next one, which is altered perception, where if your movement and your perception of movements impacted, then say, for instance, you're reaching for the salt and pepper shaker down the table, you might not be able to comprehend how far that salt and pepper shaker is, and you might not actually grab the salt and pepper shaker immediately. You might actually just either miss it by a few centimeters or something. That is the idea of altered perception, and apraxia is the loss of motor skills, the inability to make smooth movements, jerky movements. We see this as possibly Parkinson's or Parkinsonians. Then there's apathy, which is the loss of interest that's happening around them. And that's quite common as they develop over time. Then that's 7. We have an 8th one that tends to be there as well, attentional deficits, which is the inability to concentrate, focus, and keep your concentration with either conversation or whatever task they're doing. So some of these individuals might be changing their tasks from here to there, and they lose focus about sewing one thing and then suddenly working on something else. So these are the signs and symptoms when we work with patients living with dementia and or cognitive impairment. And why these things happen, why these things progress. We have potentially beta amyloid plaque that is the hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, and I'll interchangeably use Alzheimer's disease and dementia just because most of it is Alzheimer's. We think about the beta amyloid plaque, and a lot of the clinical research right now is on targeting the beta amyloid plaque, but there isn't really much of a strong movement about the benefits of actually getting rid of beta amyloid plaque, and thus we have to take a step back. And I like to look at the whole picture. And with my training as a naturopathic doctor, I think that does it justice. But I invite you to ask the following question. Well, first off, think of the brain as an organ or a cell, like any other cell in your body. What are the needs of a cell required for life? Can we just quickly input that in the chat box? What do you think every cell needs in order to survive? Go back to your grade 10 biology right here, and you probably might think, wow, I see a lot of people saying oxygen, perfect. And I see glucose, that's also perfect. We have one more missing. I see ATP, which is, the energy that if the cell is provided with these three factors, that it will create ATP. What is this third one? There we go, blood. So fluid. So every cell, perfect. You all remember Science 10. Every cell needs oxygen, fuel, and a carrier, i.e. fluid or even blood, to be able to function. And if you think about it with the brain, think about the landscape of the brain. How does it get oxygen? How does it get blood? And how does it get fuel? What has to be optimal to be able to provide these needs? So when I think about this, I think about, a highway. Think about the brain as kind of like a developing town or a developing city or even a developing nation. And you have the rest of the body that is also a developed nation. And we're trying to get the two bodies to communicate with one another and to be able to thrive. So first off, think about the body having to send whatever the brain needs: fluid, oxygen, and fuel. What does it need? Well, we think about, and to remove byproducts, absolutely. We think about this road having, it's like as if it's our blood vessels. Think about the blood vessels that go all the way to the brain, and that is delivering blood, oxygen, and fuel. If these roads are not subtle, they're not strong, then it's going to be hard to deliver these three needs to the brain. And even if you tackle the brain with all the different things that you might see online about, oh, I heard this is good for brain health, and I've heard that is good for brain health. They're all amazing, but you need to set the foundations first and foremost before the brain can actually produce its own ATP, as we've discussed. So getting the blood going to the brain is number one for me. And that, to me, in this analogy, is setting the roads to be strong and maintaining these roads to be strong, or even increasing the roads to be stronger so that we can deliver all the needs that our brains need. And then we think about the cars and the trucks and the convoy and all that as delivering the oxygen and the fuel. Not only do we need these cars as red blood cells and fuel coming in, well, we want to make sure that these vehicles are working well. So that's why when we do blood tests, we look at not just red blood cells, but we look at the size of these red blood cells. The hemoglobin, that's the carrier for oxygen in the red blood cells. And if they're not carrying oxygen well, they're not working well. These are probably like your old cars that are not really properly maintained, and they need to go into maintenance. Or these are trucks that need to be upgraded, for example. So we need to be carrying oxygen to the brain, and there's many things that could impede on this delivery of oxygen, from sleep apnea, because we're not breathing during the nighttime when we're asleep, or in terms of anemia. I can't kid you enough that I've had a number of patients that came in that would say they feel like they have a brain fog. They're not remembering things that they're forgetting things that they just learned. These doesn't have to be students. They're just not getting, they're not encoding new things. And we just correct the iron deficiency, and their brain just feels like the fog just lifted. So there's so many things that could mimic impairment of cognition. We have to look at these. It's probably because the brain was not well fed. So looking at that, so we have oxygen, we have blood, building the blood vessels, getting more blood flowing. I think about blood pressure. If your blood pressure is not optimal, if it's too high, it could damage these roads. If it's too low, it may not be able to send, the convoy to the brain as much as possible. And even maintaining the health of the vessels. You've heard about plaque in the blood vessels, atherosclerosis. Well, if that is impacted, then your delivery is also going to be impacted too. So your cardiovascular health is actually a reflection of your brain health. And we need to set that straight first and foremost. Then the third part of that is the fuel. We need glucose to be able to produce ATP, and the brain requires glucose to be able to work. Well, most of the cells need it, but there's a certain part of the brain that is most dense when it comes to insulin and insulin receptors. And insulin, for those that don't know, we need insulin as the hormone to be able to deliver the glucose from the blood to go into the cell. And if that doesn't work, well, the glucose is going to stay stuck in the blood vessels, and that's what we call diabetes. So if insulin doesn't work, we're not able to get glucose to go into the cell. How is the cell able to make ATP then? And how would that cell then function? So that one part of the brain that I'm talking about that has the densest amount of insulin receptors is your hippocampus. And the hippocampus is what encodes our short-term memory to go into mid and long-term memory. So it's what actually starts our memory process. So imagine if that is already impacted and that part of the brain doesn't get the fuel it needs because the insulin's not working, then we're not really getting that part of the brain to work in terms of short-term memory. So putting this all together, I mean, that's, a simplistic way of saying it, but if your brain is not getting enough blood, fuel, or oxygen, then something actually happens that turns on a very specific gene called the BACE1 gene, BACE-1. And this gene, when it's turned on, turns on the pathway to start producing the protein that can then contribute to producing beta amyloid plaque. So you see, we're getting at the why now. Why does this happen? And this is all foundations, just right here. Because it's foundations, there's absolutely, I would say, no silver bullet. If my patients aren't getting these three factors, then we have to reestablish that. And that means searching for the root cause and finding out why this is not happening in the first place. So I mentioned blood pressure, I mentioned iron, I mentioned insulin resistance. That's just three things. There's a minimum of 36 different biochemical factors that I have to look at that can contribute to this landscape of the health of the brain. And that's also why, because I believe that naturopathic physicians are at the forefront of this, being able to optimize dementia prevention and brain optimization, being able to screen for a number of these things through blood testing, through history taking, and so forth. So there's so much about the brain that we have to know, is the brain sitting in a proper environment first and foremost? So working with that requires a thorough consultation and assessment, looking into the blood flow of the brain, the oxygenation of the brain, and feeling the brain. You see that first three just right there. That was the first three that I have established, and I established that in all of my patients. Then from there, we have many ways of being able to support that if these factors are compromised. So if it really is the inability to fuel the brain, we want to find out, why is it that the brain's not getting the fuel in the first place? Are you not eating enough? Are you not eating enough of the right foods? Or is it that you are eating, but you're not able to get that fuel into the brain in the first place? That's what we call insulin resistance. Then there are ways to build insulin sensitivity through targeted nutritional goals and targeted supplementation, looking into even the basics of macronutrients and all that. That's the first step that you have to do with that insulin. And there are other ways when it comes to nutrition. We know that the brain is 70% fat. And there are omega-3. Someone mentioned omega-3 fish oils. That is very important for the development of the brain. I do not doubt that at all. But my first foundational step is making sure that the brain gets the right environment. Then you give it the right building blocks. So this is DHA coming from the fish oils. Then you make those connections. And connections can mean a number of things, such as stimulation. Just like how you're building muscle, you can't just give muscle protein expecting muscle to grow and you can become a bodybuilder immediately. You have to be training. So the brain needs to also train, but it cannot grow and it cannot work optimally if you're not in the right environment. So setting that blood oxygen and feel just like with the bodybuilder, where they have to be in the right gym environment for themselves, with the right gear and the right weights, right intensity, and then being able to grow with the right building blocks. So protein for the bodybuilder and DHA and a number of nutrients for the brain. So you see, what I'm trying to get at here is there are levels that we have to get in terms of foundations. And that if you set those foundations, that puts you light years ahead of being able to function cognitively because your brain is such a resilient organ. We have other tools in naturopathic medicine, such as herbs. If we know that blood and blood flow is impacted, we can look into increasing that blood flow with certain herbs like ginkgo, for example. Is it always the right thing to do when it comes to the brain? We know that ginkgo is really good for the brain. You just need to know, is it indicated for that moment in time? Is it because your brain is just not getting enough blood flow? So you always have to think about the why in this case. We have acupuncture that can also really stimulate blood flow. We can stimulate growth factors. There's so much. So nutrition, botanical medicine, homeopathy, acupuncture, lifestyle, these are all several pronged, multifactorial approaches to optimizing your brain health. So I like to share just a patient of mine that I've gotten to work quite well with and has taught me so many lessons. One of my very first patients in her 70s of Indian descent, brought in by their daughter-in-law and son. And the daughter-in-law was concerned about the patient being forgetful. She's left her food cooking on top of the stove unattended and has caused not just one, but 3 fires, to my understanding, 3 kitchen fires. And they've prohibited the mother to cook and to do anything that could result in potential harm. And then that's when we start working with each other. And there are a number of factors that I found was impeding on even just the foundations, first and foremost. One of them was blood sugar. And for someone who is of Indian descent, there is a risk factor for developing diabetes. It's more common in that group of individuals. And she was quite insulin resistant. So we corrected her insulin resistance and really sensitized the insulin to get that working. And there were a number of other factors, but once we got the fuel going and the blood flowing, exercise, sleep, a number of those factors, I think it took about almost just under a year before I actually heard back from the daughter-in-law. And we have met up, a couple times, once every couple months, just to make sure everything is okay. And suddenly the daughter-in-law just messaged me out of the blue saying, my mother just cooked a whole meal for us. And it was just shocking. And I thought, well, bring her in. Let's see what's happening. And she was more focused. She was more alert. She was conversating with me, and even though there was a language barrier, the fact was she was still wanting to communicate with me and telling the daughter-in-law to translate for her. Whereas when I first met her, she was more on the withdrawn side. Now, because I'm talking about blood sugar and all that, I have a question right here about being under the impression that insulin's not required for glucose entry into nerve cells in the CNS. You are correct, and that's why I said most brain cells. Not all brain cells do require direct glucose entry, but the one part of the brain that I know, and there is research on that has the densest number of insulin receptors, is the hippocampus. And it's the hippocampus that encodes for a short-term memory right there. And that's my focus right there for this. I hope that answers your question right there. So what can we do then to supercharge our cognition? We had to look into the foundations first and foremost. And I think for all of my patients, if you're not doing the minimum 2 things here, ideally all 6, but the 2 things that I say for everyone is if you're not sleeping well and if you're not exercising well, then you're not setting the right environment for the brain. So there's a researcher, Dr. Tansey, who has created this acronym SHIELD, Lifestyle Interventions for Brain Health, that involves basic fundamental things that if you don't actually have done, look into working on them to actually improve and optimize your brain health. So the first one being sleep, ensuring that 7 to 9 hours of sleep is of good quality, that you're waking up refreshed and well energized. Because if that's not happening, you can't out supplement a bad night's sleep or our chronic insomnia. And sleep, when you get into the deep levels of sleep, this is one of the parts of our brain called the glymphatic systems. That's our recycling and cleaning depot, opens up to about 4 to 5 times its size during deep sleep. And this is where all that deep cleaning of all the particulate matter, toxins, and even beta amyloid plaque, when they're accumulated, they can actually be shuttled out of the brain through this glymphatic system. And in fact, right now, the literature states that about 60% of the beta amyloid plaque can be cleared just with our ability to open up these glymphatic vessels. Handling stress, breath work, meditation. It's interesting I mentioned breath work here because there's now the idea of breath work and impacting our cognition. In fact, the way we breathe shallowly may not allow for all parts of the brain to actually get oxygen. And having only that deep breath, that belly breathing, deep diaphragmatic breathing can actually then get more blood to flow in the front part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. So have you ever experienced taking a deep breath and actually feeling more clearer in terms of your focus and concentration? That's because the front part of the brain is getting even more oxygen and thus is able to function even more. And the ways that reduce this blood flow to the front of the brain, one very common way is sleep deprivation. Have you ever put up an all-nighter thinking that you would study all night for your final exam, the following day, and feel that you just couldn't retrieve anything or couldn't focus as much? And that's because for every hour of sleep deprivation, you're reducing about 6% of your glucose and your blood flow flowing to the front part, the prefrontal cortex of the brain, leading to that lack of ability to concentrate and to focus. So the breath, sleep, and stress is very important. Can we all take a quick, just 4-second inhale right now? Taking 4 seconds to deeply inhale in through your nose and out through your nose or your mouth. On these kind of moments, think of the rule of fours. Inhale 4 seconds, hold 4 seconds, exhale 4 seconds, and hold 4 seconds. Do that a few times and take note about your ability to focus and your cognition. Interaction. Loneliness doubles the risk for cognitive decline. And I did this, I wrote my PhD competency exam on social isolation and loneliness in the older adult and how it impacts cognitive health. And believe me, it's crazy that something as important but simple and fundamental as interaction, we're all fundamentally social beings as Homo sapiens. And that interaction is an important part of your brain health. So look into communicating with your family members, your friends, join a book club, do something that is socially and physically active. You'll be, hitting one bird with two stones. Sorry, two birds with one stone. What am I thinking? Maybe my cognition's getting affected after talking. Exercise. Exercise is so important. And that's the second fundamental level that I say if you're not sleeping well or exercising well, you need to get those two first and foremost. Both aerobic, getting more blood flowing and getting the stretching of your blood vessels to be able to expand that blood vessel and delivering more blood. That's what we call vasodilation. And the more the vessels become more vasodilated, the more it's able to deliver blood. Because our blood vessels with physical inactivity and an unhealthy diet tends to stiffen up. And if that stiffens up, what has to work harder? Your heart. And this leads to increased blood pressure right there. So the stretching of the blood vessel just by exercising is going to make your body, it's going to communicate to make your body create more nitric oxide, which helps with vasodilating your blood vessels and delivering more of that blood. So whatever you're doing for exercise is not just getting more blood flowing at that given time, it's going to help immensely with delivering more blood over time with the stretching of the blood vessels. And anaerobic training, so resistance training, weight training, body weights, resistant bands, all that training your muscles is going to make your insulin more sensitive, a lot more sensitive than aerobic training. And it's also going to open up the GLUT4 receptors. So these are insulin receptors that when you train, don't need insulin to be able to shuttle in glucose into the cell. Most of these tend to be on muscle cells, but that also helps with controlling your blood sugar. Learning, engaging the brain in new challenges. I hope that this is challenging for you and that you're probably learning something new. And that's another aspect of our brain. We're programmed to learn new things. And you don't have to take another academic course or an academic program. If you're someone who is coming from the general public, maybe I dare you to take a naturopathic program right here. But the idea is the challenge is needed, whether that be something new, like a new language, a new skill, a new hobby, new facts. That's going to get your brain thinking, okay, now I need to encode this and store this. So new pathways are being made. So it's about that struggle and embracing that struggle. Of course, to an extent. You don't want to be so struggled that you become so frustrated and throw everything out the door or something. But to struggle enough, just like with weight training and bodybuilding, is that you're training enough that your muscles do grow and become bigger, but not so much that they'd atrophy and you hinder the amount of growth. So it's a good amount of stress. Then there's diet, insulin sensitivity, protein intake. Your neurotransmitters is mostly protein, and majority of your brain, 70% of it is fat. Make sure that you are eating as though you're replacing those cells that that you're replacing for the brain. So making sure that you are getting adequate protein, adequate fat. Some guidelines for protein: one serving is about a fist size or a deck of card size. So if you think about chicken breast, for example, as an easy source of protein, getting about a deck of cards size is already one serving. Try to get about 2 to 4 minimum on a daily basis, or about minimum 60 to 80 grams of protein per day, and ideally about 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So if you round that up to 1, if you're about 100 pounds, ideally about 70, potentially 70 to 80 grams of protein for yourself right there. Healthy fats, the guideline usually for coaching, about a thumb size of healthy oil, whether that be coconut oil or avocado oil or macadamia nut oil. Try not to look into the seed oils. They're more inflammatory, but there are a number of options for oils out there that could be very healthy in moderation. And even fiber. Fiber is needed for balancing your blood sugar. We're now needing fiber to fuel not just ourselves. We don't digest and absorb it, but our gut bacteria. So the gut microbiome is going to impact that. And there's this new field of how the gut and the brain is connected right there, the gut-brain connection. This has to do with facilitating and nurturing your gut microbiome. Not necessarily just supplementing with probiotics, but fiber is what we call a prebiotic. You're feeding the probiotics so that they stay and thrive in your gut. So this is the SHIELD acronym: sleep, handling stress, interaction, exercise, learning, and diet. So I want to take the last, I think I have about 10-ish minutes left. I know I should be at about 5. So I'd like to spend the last few minutes about, my work and what I love about doing my work as a naturopathic doctor. And that is, well, I get to think outside the box. We talked about dementia for the past half an hour plus, but not everyone living with dementia should be treated the same, because everyone's development of cognitive impairment is actually quite different. And in my practice, no 2 dementia cases are alike. And in that kind of case, I'm not treating 2 patients living with dementia or 2 cases looking to prevent dementia the same way. I'm not giving them the exact same cookie cutter recipe for each and every one of my patients. I'm screening my patients for their ability to process sugar, so insulin sensitivity. I'm screening them for their anemia, iron, B12, vitamin D, homocysteine, and many other factors. And I find that everyone's going to be very different. And thus, I get to take a personalized approach from there. And I work with the patient rather than with their diagnosis. And I get no 2 days in my practice is exactly the same. I see so many different things and so many different factors, not just with clinical, so with the nutrition aspect, but even culturally. Have you ever thought about recommending someone, let's say, because we talked about diet in the previous slide, I didn't talk about specific clinical diets that have shown benefits for brain health. You might have heard of something called the Mediterranean diet, where majority of that is reflective of their whole grains, bright and colorful fruits and vegetables, and olive oil as their source of fat. But how can you explain having that kind of diet to someone who's of Chinese descent, for example? With someone who's of Chinese descent who usually eats off of rice and organ meats, and maybe the fats are quite different. How would you be able to consider that in your workup with your patient? So my work is always going to be putting me on my feet because I have people that I have to say, well, I know the Mediterranean diet is perfect, and I know you probably tried to start that, to initiate that, but it's hard when you have other family members that may be living and having a different culturally background meals, and you have to work with that. So everyone is different in the aspect of their body, in the aspect of the socioeconomical, cultural, and even personal preferences. That's why no two patients are alike. Like no two patients with dementia and no two patients working on mitigating their risk for dementia are alike. So if that's the case, why do we treat them exactly the same in medicine? So looking forward, I currently practice in Canada, Richmond, British Columbia, Canada, and I'm currently in my own private practice for the past 5 years now and have thrived being on my own. But looking further, I hope to build my practice much further and be able to expand my practice to have even parts of my practice made for cognitive screening, parts of my practice with trained personnel to hold more treatments, whether that be intravenous therapy, injections, and even having a well-rounded team, because your team and your healthcare should not just revolve around one person. It should revolve around a team. And I think naturopathic doctors work really well together as a team, knowing the strengths and weaknesses or the gaps that we have that we can refer accordingly. So someone like speech therapists, I refer a number of my patients to get speech therapy done, to start practicing and start eliciting those interactions that's going on in that specific part of the brain. And my goal here, and I will keep Dr. Yanis up to date with this, is having a dementia-focused residency, hopefully in another 5 years. So if I were to give any advice right now for students that are here, or even prospective students that are looking to see if this is the field that they want, and this is the kind of doctor that they want to be, well, my advice for you is make sure that this is what you want. Request to look at, see a daily life, a day of a naturopathic doctor. Contact your local naturopathic doctor, ask them to either have coffee or tea with them and get to know them, ask them questions, and even sit in on their visits when possible to really see and really feel for that flow in the consultation. Because we work quite differently. A number of NDs, their first intake is usually 1 hour to be able to identify and assess for anything going on in the patient's lifestyle, diet, current treatments, and all that. You better believe that we talk a lot during that 1 hour. But in my first consultation with a patient with symptoms of dementia, I spend a full 2 hours. And that's because not only do I look into more factors of their lifestyle, I'm also cognitively assessing them as well. So make sure that if you're someone who really works well with interacting with others and working with people, this may be something great for you. You just need to make sure that this is something that you see yourself doing. And the only way you can see that and perceive that is by being there. So don't be scared to contact your local naturopathic doctor. We've all been there before, and we may not know what a naturopathic doctor does. This is an opportunity for you to get to know them. But also, not just with naturopathic medicine, observe other professions as well and gain a respect for each and every single allied health professional, because even though you may not work with the other, work as a different healthcare practitioner, we all have different skill sets, we all have different strengths. And I want a team that works with all of our strengths. And I think for us as naturopathic doctors, our strength is working with the chronic, the foundations, the fundamentals. And lastly, ask yourself, are you willing to make the sacrifice? The education to me was extremely rewarding. I wouldn't have changed my schooling or anything for that matter but it came with a lot of sacrifice. And what I mean by sacrifice is naturopathic medical schooling is no joke. I have friends from high school that we both went to school together, but they went off into conventional medicine and I went on to naturopathic medicine. And our education is quite comparable to those going through the conventional medical schools. We learn the same anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, clinical sciences, clinical diagnosis, and all that. But on top of what we learn, we have to also learn the naturopathic modalities. So acupuncture, Chinese medicine, botanical medicine, homeopathy, nutrition, on top of all of that. And you're looking at probably allotting not just the full 40 hours of education a week, but also looking at working possibly minimum 20 more hours a week on top of the 40 hours of learning to be able to facilitate, emphasize, and solidify our learning. So it's going to be quite a heavy process. But to me, it was the most successful, not the most rewarding and the most gratifying thing I've ever done. I've never felt more gratified being equipped to be able to help patients that I am right now. What do I think about, the field of naturopathic medicine will look like in about 10 to 20 years? I think we're flourishing. More people are accepting and understanding and even knowing what naturopathic medicine is. I've had instances now that I hear, walking down the street, someone's talking about, I think you should see a naturopathic doctor. The fact that these kind of conversations are happening in the everyday conversation, I mean, we're being talked about. And I think that our patients right now are benefiting and are really sharing their stories out to the world. And I think that we can make a very big impact in knowing that a lot of what we do is supporting the health of our patients and of our community. So regardless of, you have options and opportunities of not just seeing patients, but educating communities on a greater scale and being able to make a bigger impact and bigger influence for the community. So I think that concludes my talk right here. And what I really wanted to say in the beginning was, if you're following social media and all that, if you haven't done so, I invite you to take a picture of all of us. I might even just go to a different slide, but tag the AANMC, tag me, Dr. Romi Fung, ND, and let's, become even more louder. Get this going, get this out there, and share how amazing the medicine and the field is. But if you have any questions and if you want to talk with me further, I am more than happy to chat. You can contact me either through my email, contact@drromifungnd.com, or find me on a few of the social media platforms at Dr. Romi Fung ND. And if we have questions, I think I see some questions in chat box there. I'll answer them. But before I do that, I also want to thank Dr. Yanis and the Association of Accredited Naturopathic Medical Colleges for having me today.
Thank you, Dr. Fung. It was our pleasure to have you. If you can just go to the next slide before we move on. So there are 2 upcoming events that we have here. How to choose an ND school. This is going to be an admissions panel with admissions folks from all of the programs. So if you have questions about how you make this a reality for yourself, this is a great forum to attend. And then in December, we're going to be talking about health and sleep. Dr. Fung had talked about the importance of getting a good night's sleep for your brain health. And so we're going to tailor that and talk about that further in December. And so with that, we don't really have too much time for questions right now. There was one question about the patient and your dietary approach to addressing their blood sugar. If you have just kind of a minute, because we're just about out of time.
Okay, so of course there are many ways, and it has to be very specific with the patient. But there are a number of ways in terms of supplements that could make their insulin more sensitive. If they are unable to swallow the pills, then we look into lifestyles here, protein and fat and fiber tend to be the fundamentals right there that I work with. And there are a number of diets there. You've Mediterranean, ketogenic, and all that. These depend on the needs of the patient. There's so much more about that. So I invite you to actually contact me, and I'll be more than happy to talk more about that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much. Thank you all for coming and attending. I hope to see you all at a future event, and stay healthy and be kind to our fellow people. So with that, have a lovely rest of your day, and we'll see you on the flip side.
Hey, take care, everyone. Thank you so much.